Welcome back to All Things Money. My name is David Blain, and during this segment we're going to be talking about one of the most feared organizations in the federal government, the IRS, and the tax code. But before we do, as always, we'd like to hear from you if there are questions or topics that you'd like to see addressed. In fact, this is one of them. We get a lot of questions about taxes, a lot of questions about the IRS and things like that, and so we thought we would devote a couple of shows to it. So if you have questions or topics you'd like to see, give us a call at 633-0107. Shoot us an email, allthingsmoney@dlblain.com, or just go on the internet, www.dlblain.com. There you'll find our phone numbers, email, as well as information about myself, my firm, and copies of the show that you're watching or listening to today. You can download and listen to past shows at your leisure. We usually have them up a week or so after recording. So let's talk about the IRS. One of the things, the sheer volume and complexity of the IRS tax code is enormous, and the tax laws are continually added to since President Bush was in office. Some of the Bush tax cuts, as they're referred to, that were implemented, and then when the recession hit, some of the stimulus packages, they all have tax implications. They all have tax provisions in them, and they continue to add to this massive body of IRS tax code. There's the tax code, there are IRS regulations, there are IRS private rulings, there are IRS tax court rulings. The body of knowledge is just massive. Not only is it massive, but it's extremely complicated, that the majority of the IRS personnel don't know a fraction of what is in it. Out in the marketplace, experts like myself in the tax code, or your CPA or a tax attorney, even we cannot possibly have all that information in our head. It's just too much information, too complex. And so the way I like to refer as taxes, in a good way, is taxes is a game. And it's a game that the objective of the game, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court, in fact, is you are not obligated to pay any more tax than is legally required, which is essentially the minimum amount of tax. You're not required to pay more tax than is necessary. And so the game, in the end, is to try to pay the least amount of tax possible. Now, I always get a couple people, they say, oh, well, I don't mind paying tax. It goes to support this program or that program, and that's great. The IRS and the Treasury Department do accept voluntary contributions. You just make out your check to the U.S. Treasury and send it on in to assuage your feelings of guilt. In the meantime, I myself do not have any problem learning the tax code and taking advantage of the deductions and things that are listed in there. So having said that, you have to know the rules of the game in order to win the game. It's just like if you were playing baseball and someone stuck a bat in your hand and they said, get up there, and you didn't understand that you got 3 strikes or you were out, or that you were supposed to hit the ball and run to first base, you certainly are not going to win that game. And so that's what I want to do, is try to give you some rules of the road, to at least so that you know the rules and it will enable you to possibly win the game. Because believe me, the IRS, even though they may not know the rules completely, they are the ones that get to enforce the rules. And so it just helps out if you know what the rules are. So first, before we start, let's get into a little history of the income tax. First of all, there was no income tax until 1862. The Civil War, it lasted for about 10 years until 1872. The country imposed an income tax to try to help pay for the war. But once the war was over and Reconstruction was begun in 1872, it was stopped. The income tax then came back full-time and has been in continuous operation, so to speak, since 1913, when the tax system that we have today was started. It certainly has morphed into something much larger, but that essentially the roots of the tax system that we have today started in 1913. a very progressive tax system that starts out very small and progressively taxes incomes at a higher rate. One other interesting concept to learn about the tax code is what we call Tax Freedom Day. And Tax Freedom Day is essentially that day of the year at which your taxes are paid for the year. So, for example, for the average American, Tax Freedom Day comes somewhere between April and May. That means that from January 1 through April and into May, depending on the particulars of the tax code and the particular person, you're essentially working for the federal government. If you add in state taxes, property taxes, local taxes, sales taxes, cigarette taxes, gas taxes, bread taxes, every other type of tax, of course, that date moves on into the year, probably into November. But for the federal tax, what we call Tax Freedom Day generally falls around April to May. So essentially until April or May, you're working for Uncle Sam up until that point. It's very important to know that date when the tax laws were first enacted back in 1913 was in January. It took people very little amount of time to earn enough money to pay their federal taxes. Today, it's on into May. I also want to mention there are some alternatives to the progressive tax system that we have. Number one is what we call the flat tax, where people are taxed at a flat level of tax on the income that they earn. And number two is what they call a national sales tax, slightly different than what Europe has, and a VAT tax, but along the same lines. Well, we'll pick up with that when we return. We have to take a short break right now. So for All Things Money, I'm David Blain, and we'll be back after this message.